Hi, Lee.
I'm gonna put this on mute for a minute while I get things ready. I'll be back.
Hi, Ivan. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's like I was a little bit out of open source. Yeah, I had a knee surgery, so it was pretty busy month. Yeah.
How did it go?
Yeah, well, but I cannot step on my work until Monday. So,
Oh, what a pity.
yeah.
I hope you get better soon. The knee is really, it's such a fragile part of the body.
Yeah, but it's actually, it's positive in a sense. It's helped me to understand bus factor. So, yeah, it's like, that's why it's good that GraphQL over HTTP, there is like people around this project and for other projects. I'm like, who want on board new contributors.
Sure.
Hi, Andy. Hi, Dotan.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, good. Lee said he will be online in a couple of minutes. Yeah, by the way, I was totally out of touch with open source, so we didn't do any progress on new PRs. I had a knee surgery, so it was pretty busy month. Last 2-3 weeks. 2-3 weeks was pretty interesting.
Yeah, unfortunately, the last GraphQL over HTTP meeting was kind of, we skipped it because we couldn't figure out a good time. And yeah, so we got one this month again. Hopefully we will get it together by then.
Yeah, it's but there is a big news. By the way, if there is a news, GraphQL over HTTP was moved to GraphQL organization. So it's now
pretty cool.
Yeah. So it's now kind of official project, and if you want to join this group, it's the same rules. You just create PR against agenda.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi.
Hiya.
Good morning. Is Lee's audio having trouble?
Are we waiting for something specific? Ali, we can't hear you, Lee, by the way. So.
Let's see. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There you go.
All right. Thank you for mentioning that. I was just over here talking, assuming that you could hear me. I'm going through the last couple pull requests right now. So if you're not on the agenda or if you see anything missing, feel free to send that up as a quick PR. I'm just going to try to get through the last couple of them now before we kick off the meeting. I'm worried that I've made a bad merge because I'm seeing weird things in the pull requests. Okay, that is all of them. Hopefully the agenda is up to date now. Let me know if you see anything that looks out of place. Okay, let's get things going. As usual, first, a quick reminder that by joining, we all agree to the SPAC membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. There are links in the agenda if you forget what the contents of those things are. And let's go down and do just quick intro, quick name to face. We will go in the order that it's listed in the agenda. And if you get to the bottom and you haven't mentioned yourself, then please do so, followed by sending a pull request to add yourself to the agenda. So I'll start with me. So hi, everybody, I'm Lee. Next up is Andy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy. I'm working on GraphQL Java, working on GraphQL things in Atlassian. Hello from Sydney.
Hello, everyone. I'm Benji. I'm working on the GraphQL suite and also on the tagged input types, the tag types.
Vaughn, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. So I'm Ivan, and I'm maintaining GraphQL.js and a few other repositories on GraphQL Foundation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Denis, and I'm trying to standardize the GraphQL over WebSocket protocol.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dutan. I'm from the Guild, working mostly on GraphQL CodeGen. I'm here today to talk about GraphQL, TypeScript, and how we can make it better.
Dan Schaefer at Facebook, involved in GraphQL back in the day, and then still involved in a lot of the things going on at Facebook.
Lily, oh, I'm sorry, Rob. Liliana with First Dibs, working on Different Stream.
And Rob from First Div is also working on Different Stream.
Hey, I'm Steven. I'm at Netflix working on our GraphQL infrastructure.
Hey folks, I'm Vince. I work at New Relic and I maintain the Absinthe Elixir GraphQL library.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I work at TakeShape. on GraphQL API stuff.
Hi, I'm Mark. I'm leading the GraphQL efforts over at Yelp.
Hi, I'm Benedikt. I work on GraphQL, PHP, and Lighthouse.
Did we miss anybody? Anybody else?
Oh, I'm Ricky. I work on Graphical, the GraphQL LSP, VS Code GraphQL, and GraphQL Playground, and I work at Gatsby.
Awesome. Did we miss anybody else? Rob, I think we missed you. Rob Zoo.
Hey, looks like I was on mute, sorry. Yeah, I'm Robert from AWS, and I work with a couple of internal and external AWS GraphQL use cases.
I think that was everybody. All right, send PRs if you, for the last couple of y'all who weren't on the agenda. Welcome everybody, great to see all your faces. Lots of familiar faces for me and a small handful of new ones. We've got a pretty packed agenda. I see one volunteer for note-taking, Benji, as per usual, who's already outlined out our whole notes. Does anybody want to volunteer to help out with Benji?
Yeah, I'll help out as well.
Awesome, thank you, Stephen. There's a link in the agenda for anyone who wants to follow along with the notes and help out. Let's take a quick look at open action items. I don't know that any were filed from the last meeting. We should have a meta action item to file those. I think there's we might need to still translate those notes. The only open ones are relative to custom scalar editorial pass. It's still open on me. I'm kind of waiting on some spec, some other things we're working on, making sure that the legal paperwork for all the specs in place, because I want to do the final editorial passes on those right before we're ready to cut. So that's the reason why I'm waiting on that one. Introspection shortcuts, that was from a couple of meetings ago. I think that one's still open and pending. Update the input union RFC. I don't know that we ever folded in our notes to those docs. So I think that's on either Benji, Vince, or myself to make good on that. And similar, there's multiple issues relative to that one. So not a lot of progress on existing open issues. That's okay. I know everybody's been pretty busy, as I have as well. But we have a pretty packed agenda. Let's review it briefly just to make sure everything we want to talk about is the right set. We're not missing anything, and this is roughly the right order. We're gonna go through custom scalar update, defer and stream update, tag type RFC, field coordinates RFC, GraphQL over WebSocket refresh, adding generics to a couple of nodes in TypeScript, and TypeScript migration plan progress. Does that sound like the right agenda and a rough right order? Any suggestions for additions or changes?
We normally try and make the longer tasks towards the end, get the quicker ones out of the way first. So you might want to move my tag type towards the end.
I can do that. We will do tag types last. And we will start with custom scalar updates. So with that, Andy, I will hand it to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I just want to give a quick update what happened so far and where we are, and basically encourage everybody to engage if anybody's interested. We had a specific smaller gathering around custom scalars like a couple of weeks already ago, maybe 1 month, probably more. And we came up with a rough vision what we want to do. And as a result, we have actually a new repository inside the GraphQL org in GitHub, which is called, I don't want to lie, it's called, I forgot about GraphQL scalars, GraphQL minus scalars, yes. And so we have a couple of issues open, 2 pull requests where we kind of outline our vision, how a custom scalar hosting could look like, and yeah, I would encourage everybody to have a look and maybe contribute to discussion or even more if they're interested. And of course, if you have any questions, sure.
Nice. I'm pretty excited about this. I think there's some groundwork required for us to make this tool useful, but thank you, Andy, for kicking off the effort.
No worries. I want to one specific shout out. Like I started a pull request based on Gatsby, and I know there are like also in Discord people who know it better, much better than I do. And this idea was like to use Gatsby to kind of generate a specific scalar URLs and have some governments around the custom scalar specs. And we don't know if this is really the right technology solution. So if somebody with more knowledge around it would like to have a look at it, I would be internally grateful. Thanks.
All right, well, there's a call. So if you're interested in helping Andy out with that, please check out that repo, join in. I think something pretty great could happen there. Any other questions or comments for Andy on custom scalars?
I didn't even use my 5 minutes. So.
Love it.
I have lots of questions that I'm going to read up on this repo first, but I know that I'd like to make sure to get that implemented soon in GraphQL 1 and in 2 as well. So
amazing. All right, that's great. I'm feeling pretty confident. Okay, let's move on to an update from Liliana and Rob on Defer and Stream.
So I just have a bunch of pull requests listed out. There aren't really any updates from the last meeting. The first pull request is just a small one to update the RFC from what we discussed last time of changing is final to has next. So that's just a small update. Then we had said last time that the next, I think, milestone was to work on getting Defer and Stream support merged to GraphQL.js behind a flag. The one roadblock with that is that there's a breaking change in the types where the top level GraphQL function can now also return an async interval. So we talked about putting it into a branch until the 16 version was cut, the alphas. I did also split out a small chunk of that PR into GraphQL supporting async interval resolvers. So that's allowing resolvers to return async intervals in GraphQL.js. So that's not a breaking change. So if that's okay, I think that would be good to get merged in before anything else. And then that'll make the other PR a little bit smaller.
I just merged your first one because that one was straightforward.
Yeah, and then otherwise we have the our draft spec edit, looking to get some feedback on that. And the I wrote up an RFC for GraphQL over HTTP of exactly how that format is going to be sent over the wire. So any feedback on that too would be good. And then I think after the other GraphQL.js stuff is merged, then we could look at merging the Express GraphQL PR.
One suggestion that might allow us to get out of the deadlock of waiting for breaking changes is either introducing a flag on that function or introducing a new function. That's clearly listed as experimental, just like call it experimental GraphQL instead of GraphQL. That way it's an additive change rather than a breaking change. And that way people can kind of opt into playing with this stuff in that way. And you can like start writing tests and do all the stuff you want to do and have it merged and start to land and iterate without breaking anything for anybody. That might be a way to unblock so that you can actually start making progress on this stuff without having to wait for a major breaking change. Once you have it landed and it feels good and we want to incorporate it, then surely the appropriate long-term API is to have one shared function, which would be a breaking change, but presumably we could like defer that to a separate step.
Cool.
Yeah, sounds good.
So actually, I wanted to discuss idea how to do that. So my plan was to have a branch and to have a separate package release, either like separate tag or separate package, because that way we can experiment with, like, one of the issue from my side is that execute function became too polymorphic with its return value. So it can return data response, it can return promise of response, or it can return async iteratable. So it's like 3 different types of return. So that's why I actually like want us to release a final API, final version, but as a separate package. And we can do that because GraphQL.js is a peer dependency. So a person can choose what peer dependency, like end user is choosing what GraphQL.js version he's using. So I was thinking about creating separate branch and separate release. What do you think about that?
I'm a little wary of developing in long-term, long-lived branches, just because there's the long-term maintenance of making sure that the two don't get out of sync and that other unrelated changes are merged into both master and the long-lived branch. That makes me nervous. I hope we can land on something that allows us to maintain one line of history. The separate packages, it seems like it could work. I see that as probably the roughly equivalent to having a separate API. But you make a good point that as we're adding in these additional capabilities, the GraphQL function and the execute function are becoming a lot more polymorphic. And had we designed GraphQL.js from day one, we might not have decided that polymorphism was the right thing. Perhaps we would have decided that everything was an async iteratable and just regular queries yielded one value and then finalized immediately, or something like that. So it might also be an opportunity to introduce execute sync or execute async or execute stream, or like separately named functions that don't necessarily only operate on a subset of queries. Like execute sync is a subset, but execute async or execute stream might be like the total set, but the response type doesn't need to be polymorphic. I don't know if that's the right answer, but I think you should consider exploring some directions like that. And that could be interesting because then you could allow, rather than depending on one version of the package versus another version of the package, there could just be a single version, but developers could decide which subset they want to support via like which functions they hook up. So if you decide you only ever want to handle synchronously executing GraphQL functions, you could use execute sync. And if you want to support everything up to async streams, then you can use that model. And especially once we get support hooked into Express GraphQL and other HTTP layers, then hopefully that just becomes the reasonable default. But I don't know if that's exactly the right thing, but I just encourage you all to kind of think about what kind of proposals would allow us to maintain a development model that focuses on one branch or one package to ease maintenance, and give developers some choice in deciding what they want long-term. Might help us break out of eventually there probably will be some breaking changes, but if there's a path that allows us to start to play with that's additive only, that could be pretty nice. I don't know, what do you think of that?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
How about we create experimental folder inside the package? So when you import stuff, you import GraphQL /experimental /execute or execute stream something. So like I'm partly worried if we mark something as experimental, people usually don't read documentation or don't read. We actually have a problem with documentation, but they don't read source code or they don't check like Doxygen, JSDoc comments. So I'm worried that even if we mark something as experimental, it's not really obvious it's experimental.
I agree. It's got to either be in the name of the function itself or in the name of the package you're importing it from, something where you can't get away from the fact that you have to type the word experimental as you're using it. I'm on board with that.
So idea is to create separate package, but create a folder inside the package. So you can import everything from GraphQL, but if you want experimental features, you import it from GraphQL/experimental.
I want to kind of emphasize this also, like that's a big non-spec feature, and I don't know the details, and I think Ivan and others will figure out, but like GraphQL.js has kind of a lighthouse responsibility. I don't know if that's the right word for the ecosystem. So people will automatically assume what GraphQL.js provides is kind of GraphQL, what GraphQL should provide, and other implementations like GraphQL Java will have to deal with, where's your defer implementation? And we have to go back and, it's not specified. We can't do this yet. We don't. So it's like, I would highly encourage to make it clearly visible that this is like a non-spec feature at the moment.
Yes, so why actually it's an important question, because as part of Summer of Code, there is a student working on a new parser for GraphQL.js to support like graphical use cases, more advanced use cases. And realistically, we cannot release polished one, but at the same time, we want to release something by the end of summer. So it's not only stream and defer, we need a place where we can put experimental stuff. I agree with you. So it's like reference implementation. So basically, if we merge something, we promote it across other implementations. So what do you think if we will have folder inside source control called experimental? So not only inside the package, but inside source control, experimental folder and things inside it. Is it like marked clearly enough, or you still have some doubts?
That sounds like a good plan to me. GraphQL.js has always sort of bridged that gap between, it is both the reference implementation of the spec, but it is also the tool by which we develop new ideas before they enter the spec. As long as they're clearly delimited, then I think we're in good shape. The folder structure sounds totally reasonable to me. My only recommendation would be we might like different, in this particular approach, that sounds totally fine, having to import the version of execute or the version of the GraphQL top level function or whatever we decide to name it from GraphQL/experimental. I think that would be very clear to people that they're pulling in something that's likely not part of the core spec. In other cases, like for a flag on an existing function, like that probably can't come from a folder. So you would just call that flag experimental something, which that pattern already exists to a degree in the GraphQL.js code base. But it doesn't bother me at all that we'd have experimental things as long as they're clearly marked as such.
I have a slight issue with this in that for libraries, it makes it hard to know whether the user is using a experimental version of GraphQL or not. So for libraries that support a wide range, particularly ones that write in ES6 modules where you have import and you can't really like wrap a require with a try catch, it's very hard to detect. Whereas if we were to export it as an execute _ experimental, then an import asterisk from GraphQL would then have the experimental property on it or not, and we can just sniff to see if it's there. So there's just a slight JavaScript / ES modules integration issue there that I think would lean in the favor of using names of the function rather than a specific path. That said, I'm happy either way.
for GraphQL.js and even other implementations, would we want common naming that distinguishes a feature that is in draft of the GraphQL spec? Because even in other implementations like GraphQL Java, we have interfaces implementing interfaces, which is, it's in, it's in master, but it's, it's not in the release spec. And so there might be, some other implementations of clients that, are tooling or things. And so, there's experimental things, but then there's specifically draft features.
My 2 cents on this, the GraphQL release doesn't really matter at the moment anymore. Sorry to say this, like everything that is merged into master is considered a stable feature which services and server across ecosystems start implementing it. And I don't consider it a draft at all. It's a feature we support, we implement it, we consider it stable. The bar set by Lee over the years for things going on is very high. I have not seen anything, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Lee or anybody else, that we kind of reverted once merged.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that. We set a super high bar for things merging into master. We basically consider if it's merged into master, then it's extremely unlikely to change before an official spec cut. But what Andy said is mostly true. The spec cut is meant as like a legal process more than like a technical process. So we should always be able to treat whatever's on master as like the continual point. And if we still want to kind of cut those once a year so we can kind of point to them. But it's a very, I've been modeling the GraphQL release process off how the JavaScript community has been, or the ECMA process has been working out in the last couple of years. They've been doing something pretty similar where they cut annually. But in practice, really what they're doing is each particular proposal makes its way to draft stage or final stage at different times of the year. And in practice, each browser is just picking them up as they go with their own release processes. So I think anything that is in draft is reasonably safe to include in production libraries because we keep a relatively high bar for that. There are a handful of things that are proposals that have not been merged to master yet, but are in those like final phases. Those are the ones that are more on the fence. I think TypeScript takes a pretty interesting approach where they actually choose that phase as the one where they release things. So if something is in the phase right before it's officially merged into an upcoming release, then that's the line where they start to include it. I'm okay with this being kind of up to each library as to what they want to do, but my sense is that process for TypeScript has worked out reasonably well as a balance between people wanting new features as soon as they're discussed and people wanting stability over the long run, because the process can be kind of reasonably long and you want to balance between those two. And then, I don't know if we need necessarily like a fine grain set of terminology that we use as something being experimental versus draft versus final. We can just use experimental as just like a catch-all. That's like, here's the thing that we're testing that we don't have confidence enough yet to say you should use this. It's unlikely to change. And in the rare cases, there actually aren't many that I can think of in the past, but in the rare case that we would have something that's in draft status that changes in a breaking way rather than changing in probably like a spit polish kind of way, then we would use this meeting in order to figure out like how to mitigate that, since most library authors are here, and figure out how to like build a path from A to B. But I see that as like an exceptionally rare circumstance. Okay, pulling back to the agenda, it sounds like next steps here is actually just to manage through some of these pull requests and make sure that we have a reasonable strategy for how to incorporate these things and merge them in a way that will allow people to immediately start testing them and making it clear that they're not official yet.
A quick clarifying question. So are we moving away from experimental flags and then opting for the experimental directory instead? Or is this a world where we sort of support both depending on the use case?
That's my pitch, is that we should support both. I don't particularly mind whatever the mechanism is, as long as the actual developer has to type the word experimental or something like it when they go use the thing. That way they don't have to Yvonne's point, they don't have to discover it in the documentation to realize that it's experimental. Then we're good. And whether that's the name of a function or a flag being passed in or a slash path in the import, I think all of those are totally reasonable ways to implement that pattern.
Okay, cool.
Let's next talk about field coordinates. Mark.
Yeah, thanks. So, okay, so the elevator pitch here is we want to be able to say that the email field on the user type can be written as user.email. So it's kind of intuitive, hopefully uncontroversial. A bunch of tooling and libraries do this already. So that's kind of one half of the RFC, is just kind of, officially ordaining this as part of the spec, so there's no confusion over the naming. And then the other RFC in that pull request is being able to take a document, a query, and say that, lowercase user name corresponds to the name attribute on the user type. So kind of translating that, given a schema and a document, being able to map things in that query back to field coordinates on a schema. Hopefully that made some sort of sense. So I'm here today because I've never really kind of done anything spec related before. I don't know what I don't know. So I wanted to kind of get your take on what next steps might be. And I also don't know if this is something where there's like runtime, like code changes that need to be made in any of the packages. I wrote a library that implements that second RFC, which goes from a example query to a set of field coordinates given a corresponding schema as well. So it's unclear to me if that just lives as like, third-party tooling, or if that's like a function on GraphQL.js or something. But I think other than that, there's no sort of like runtime execution implications here. This is just a nice way of standardizing what different packages in the ecosystem call the same thing, but they do it slightly differently. So yeah, that's my pitch.
Can you explain more what you mean by this mapping, this like second part of the RFC? I don't know if I totally understood that part.
Yeah. So I have a link. Let me put it in the doc. It might sort of explain it a bit better.
You can also post it in the chat here real quickly, just so people can find it.
Yes. Okay. How do I? God, I'm going to embarrass myself now. How do I send a message to the whole group? Show chat. Here we go. Send to everyone. Cool. Okay. Okay. So it's a function that takes in two parameters. It takes in a SDL, like a big old blob of schema, and it takes in a query. And given a query, you can go from that query to a set of field coordinates. And so, there's some subtle implementation details here that we might want to standardize, because how do you resolve, these leaf nodes to the type in the schema? It's slightly non-obvious. And perhaps controversial enough that I didn't want to sort of combine these two things.
Well, that answers my question. I understand what you mean now. So these are all of the type field pairs that are visited if you were to execute this particular query.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and type field pairs was like the original name I had. I remember seeing that on some library somewhere, but I can't remember where. And then someone suggested field coordinates because that's what they do in GraphQL Java, if I remember correctly. And a bunch of people have already kind of taken a look at the issue that I opened and gave me some feedback. So thanks to everyone who did that.
I like the name field coordinates. I almost see there as being two different things here. One is just like, candidly, what should the delimiter be? And I can imagine that's something that we may end up wanting to bike shed. I've seen dot, I've seen colon. I think that'll be a discussion. And then the second thing is like, what does it look like in the spec? And my initial instinct is I feel like once we decided on the delimiter, a non-normative note just being like, hey, by the way, if you're trying to refer to, I mean, I can't even say it. If you're trying to refer to user.name, do it with user.name. Feels like it would be like fairly non-controversial, assuming the delimiter wasn't. And I don't even know, you know, if it ends up being useful in GraphQL.js. I mean, there's a ton of tooling in GraphQL.js that's just sort of like utility functions that were useful and not in the spec. I don't have a strong sense for whether this is just like, yes, everyone's going to end up using it, move it in, or whether it's a third-party thing. But I feel like the non-normative note, honestly, I'm like thinking, you know, it's the type of thing that I could imagine as we were putting the first version, being like, hey, we always call this user.name. Should we just like mention that we call it there? And we just would have thrown the non-normative note in. So I'm really supportive of something like this.
I would suggest keeping the actual utility, code utility separate, just because I can imagine a whole list of questions that might come out of the woodwork. Like, what happens if you query an interface type? Does it give you all the potential things that could be in the interface, or does it give you the interface itself? And it's depending on the actual thing you want out of this, you would want that to be different. And it's probably also honestly just going to iterate a lot faster if it's a standalone package. So I think that particular step, and there's probably also more things you want to do. Like maybe you also want to do the opposite, where given field coordinates in a schema, you want to extract the particular instance out of there or something like that. There's probably a whole host of things that we want to be able to offer people tools for that may or may not pan out to be actually wildly useful. But it does seem like a useful convention that then we could build these tools on top of. So that to me feels like a vote of confidence. Other questions that I have beyond bike shedding about punctuation is if we can refer to a field on a type, then presumably we'd want to be able to refer to any other thing in a schema. And could this proposal be expensive enough to cover all of those? So I'm thinking like, is the syntax for a field on an input object the same as a field on an output object, considering that those are like kind of similar but kind of different? We should have an answer to that. And or arguments on a field on a type, like that's another thing that kind of shows up in graphical documentation that we might want to have a convention for. But I agree with Dan that this feels like we could stick this relatively high up in the GraphQL spec as a non-normative note that says when referring to fields or when referring to arguments, or here's the standard convention for doing so. And to the degree that we can then use that convention throughout the spec, that'll just kind of cement the pattern.
Yeah, I'm looking up, do we already use that convention in the spec and we just never mention it? I feel like we probably do.
That I literally pulled up the spec to start to search through it, and I haven't found an example yet, but I had the exact same thought.
I don't think so. I don't think it's used in the spec.
I have an idea of what this could lead to. What if there was like a GraphQL like type literal notation, so that you could, when specifying a field for a type, or a field on a type, you could refer to a type.field. So you could be like, whatever user.email is, make that the type used for this field, whether it's a type or a scalar. So it'd be like eventually down the line. Does that make sense? Like a dot notation for types, so that you could reuse a type.field for another field, for example.
Oh, I see what you're saying. That one's probably slightly more controversial.
Yeah, but I'm just imagining what it could lead to, just as idea of a dot notation type thing.
Totally.
I think to go back to Lee's question earlier about how sort of extensible is this, and can we reference other, things in the schema like arguments. There is some discussion in the original issue that I raised. Mark Andre suggested sort of something similar to when you try and use like document query selectors, and you can specify sort of things in square brackets. So I think this, yeah, I hadn't really considered that for the first draft, how we reference other things, other node types, but I would like to think that this could be extensible to that, but I don't quite have a clear picture about what that looks like yet. But maybe that's something we can sort of iterate on in the RFC.
Might be worth bringing up what Dotan mentioned, that they're using something similar in GraphQL Mesh and in some packages of GraphQL tools. So maybe you all could collaborate on like a standard for that, since they're using a similar pattern, kind of.
Actually, we're using the simplest form of that. So the first part, we're just using dot, and the first part is the type. And we're just taking the type map and look for the type by name, and then use the fields to find the actual field. But that's right. I mean, there are like tons of other use cases that might not be supported. I think it all depends what are the utilities are meant for. I mean, if it's just finding a type or a field quickly, or having a standard for finding something by name, so this could be fine. But if it's for more than that, like Lee said, if there are like arguments and tons of other use cases that could make it much more complicated. But yeah, we're using just the simple way of this kind of querying.
Yeah, I think it's also worth clarifying that I did some sleuthing on the internet to try and find what tooling wants this sort of today. And it's mostly kind of in the space of monitoring, alerting stuff. I know that's kind of what we use it for at Yelp. And so generally that's kind of, I'm gonna end up regretting saying this, but like generally you kind of only care about, hey, this query, this field has been accessed 100,000 times. And so we kind of mostly care about sort of referencing fields. So kind of, yeah, going with that simplest thing first of just being able to reference a field node. Does that seem like a reasonable thing to do first, or would you want to see a sort of comprehensive, we can reference any node type, out the gates?
Yeah, we also support wildcards. So you can ask for query.wildcard to get all fields. So it could be, it has the potential to be complicated.
We have just to echo what Mark said, we have the exact same thing where we effectively bump a counter for user.name, and then you can ask a counter for user.name in order to see whether a given type and field has been used. My initial instinct is, I mean, just looking at the amount of tooling out there that says user.name, this has already kind of become a de facto standard. And so I see a little downside to taking the thing that is already a de facto standard and making it a de jure standard, especially if it's non-normative, doesn't affect parsing, doesn't affect execution, it's a non-breaking change. It's just, if it means that the tooling over the next 6 months, we end up with everyone converged on a single delimiter instead of 3 different delimiters, that feels like a pure win. I think it could eventually expand to include additional things, and I think that probably would be useful as well, especially if we began to see those emerge as de facto standards, or if people started needing, if I need to refer to, user.name prefix, which is the argument, do I use colon, do I use bracket? Like, if we start to see discussion there, then like having the non-normative note just make a standard thing. But I don't know. I think if you would ask me 6 months ago, by the way, did we ever specify like user.name as the way to refer to a type in field in the spec? I would have been like, I don't know, we might have. Like it's so common, and I think it has become so ubiquitous that it feels like the non-normative note would be relatively uncontroversial and easy to land.
I'm gonna
modular bike shedding punctuation.
Yeah, bike shed punctuation. My vote is to keep the dot because that's what Graphical and a handful of other existing tools use. The nice thing about non-normative note is it means that if you use a colon instead of a dot, it doesn't all of a sudden make you, from a legal point of view, not GraphQL, which is like sounds pedantic, but like kind of important to provide the flexibility. Because to your point, like there isn't actually like runtime code that depends on this existing beyond some tools that people might build. And those are kind of like, you can use them if you want to use them, but you don't have to. I will pitch at least going a little bit beyond just the ability to reference fields and also be able to reference arguments on fields, especially since I'm just like following along some of the links. And you linked to Marc-André's tweet from like 6 months ago, talking about literally exactly this thing, which is a great sign that this is the right thing to standardize. But he, in the like GraphQL Ruby example, it's talking about both arguments and fields. So it seems like there's already a pretty clear use case for being able to identify both of those two things. And the fields one is easy. Like, sure, we could bike shed on the punctuation a little bit, but it sounds like you're already getting a sense that there's a majority, or at least a plurality opinion that dot is the right thing. But like, what's the right thing for arguments? Is it a colon between them? Is it parentheses with colon after the thing? Like, there's a handful of proposals we could kind of pitch that I think it's worthwhile to dial that in. To the degree that are others beyond that, I don't know. Like, we could just kind of say, you know, this reasonably covers, that actually might reasonably cover all of them. I think if you cover types, fields, and arguments.
We'll want to make sure we cover unions, interfaces, input unions, but I think that's relatively straightforward. Or not input unions, sorry. Unions, interfaces, and input types.
Interfaces.
But I think that's relatively straightforward.
Interfaces you get also, like type.name you get. Yep, you get that for free. Unions don't have
types or don't have fields.
They don't have fields,
really,
and I don't think you want to necessarily be able to reference like a member of a union. I don't know that that has the same kind of value that we're talking about here.
I actually think input type, interface, object type all have the exact same behavior, but if we are going to put the non-normative node in, it's worth saying you can do this for types, you can do this for interfaces, you can do this for input types.
Yeah, I think that might be enough coverage that you could reasonably claim this covers, quote, everything. But it also, I think another part of this discussion that's worth kind of hammering down is purpose. So you're hearing like, hey, is this about taking a query and decomposing it into field pairs? Is that what this is for? Is this about wildcard subselection? In which case, what's the syntax for wildcards? Is it not about those things? In which case you say like firm line in the sand, like that's not part of this discussion at all. I think for the RFC to move forward, that's another thing that you should stake a hard claim on. Be crisp about exactly what problem you're solving. My read on this is crisply, the problem is there are components of your schema that you want to be able to have a unique identifier for that's human readable. And that should be able to, A, given a schema and given one of these unique identifiers, you should be able to like find that thing. And B, someone should be able to read it both in tooling and in like error reports or something like that and make sense of it. In fact, Dan, maybe that's the case where we've done this before. I think error reports in GraphQL JS is the case where we're formatting these already.
Oh yeah, you're right. That's exactly.
So GraphQL JS has, if I'm remembering correctly, has like error path, I guess, but that's like a dot separated or array or whatever, kind of just like the
we
query.
GraphQL is the place where, I mean, this was a de facto standard in GraphQL forever.
Yeah, I think what Lee's saying
and
about
Playground,
the problem, So I think what Lee said about the problem statement is certainly like very, very true. And that's kind of like the problem statement of like the first RFC that I put out. And then the second document is the problem statement there is how do you go from a query to a list of those fields so you can increment a sort of metrics counter somewhere. And there's sort of existing tooling that does this as well. Like I think Apollo Studio kind of does this. So that's kind of why I separated it out. I think there's like two, to use Lee's words there, two crisp problem statements.
Maybe another way to assemble that instead of thinking about them as like different unique problem statements is instead to frame it as a use case. So you can crisp up your problem statement as you want to be able to uniquely identify some component of your schema, where a component can be a type, a field on that type, or an argument on that field. And then like, why? Okay, why is that useful? Well, here's a list of use cases. And you don't have to explain how that use case works in detail, but you can say, perhaps you want a counter service that tracks the usage of each field each type and each argument, then you might want to translate a query to those unique identifiers. Or documentation, where you might want to refer to a particular component of the schema and make it hyperlinkable and go to the appropriate place. Again, you need a unique identifier. So I think those are just two, but you could probably come up with a handful of these that are all those. And then you don't need to worry about like, do I need to go through a spec process or have a problem statement or whatever for the actual details of how to implement those. Now you've like packaged it all up as like one thing of unique identifiers for components of schemas. And then all the actual implementations of those bits and pieces can just be packages that you go build to the degree that you're interested in building them.
Okay. I don't want to monopolize everyone else's time. I hope that, I think this is recorded, so hopefully I can rewatch that back and translate that back into the RFC.
I want to add an aspect quickly. Like, it's not only about the ability to name, like identify something specifically. For me, there's equally value in actually giving this thing a name itself. So like calling it field coordinates, it's a really valuable thing in forming like a consistent mindset around constructs in the ecosystem. So it's like, it's the syntax of referring is important, but also what is this thing called is also an important aspect of this PR in my mind. So yeah.
I agree, and especially if you're going to scope arguments in, which again I recommend that you would, because I see a clear use case for them that aligns to the others. Then is field coordinate still the right name? So we could maybe bike shed on the naming a bit, but that's another thing you might think about. But I think what you're hearing is a strong sign of support that this is a thing worth dialing in.
Okay, I will incorporate as best I can this feedback in an RFC and start annoying you all some more through PRs, and we'll see where we go from there. Thanks.
Nice. I moved the issue that you created on GraphQL spec from strawman to proposal, just to kind of capture the fact that this is something that we're interested in moving forward.
Sweet. Thanks.
Okay. Next, let's talk about GraphQL over WebSockets. Denis.
Hello, everyone. So I hope you all hear me well. And yeah, the point of me being here is actually discussing a few things about the existing implementation and the existing protocol, which is at Apollo's side. And it's kind of mind-boggling for me, to be honest, that it's so unmaintained and it's like really stale. And the question that I want to ask, like the first question I want to ask is, how many of custom implementations are you guys aware of? I mean, are subscriptions used that much, or is it just me that I have a feel that real time is kind of really important in the development of apps in general?
I've worked on projects where most of our schema was in subscriptions.
Yeah, so it's kind of weird for me to look at that project and see so many PRs and so many issues and just like nobody's working on it. So I first had this thing where I wanted to implement subscriptions some time ago, and then I used the library that everybody uses, like the thing that I feel that everybody uses, and it's just kind of broken, to be honest, like to not censor the words that I'm using. But yeah, the question actually is, so this project, which you can find the link to in my agenda item. So you can find the existing aggregate of all important and pressing issues with the existing subscriptions transport over a WebSocket thing, and a draft PR, which is like a refresh of the protocol, handling some security implications, which are quite serious for me. So I read about an issue, which is like, you can circumvent the actual onConnect callback. So not even issue a connect initialization request, and you can still start subscriptions or start operations on top of that, which is kind of like, wow, how is this not fixed and how do people not care about it? So yeah, I really want to have this approach to this where I want to tackle the security implications first and then go after that. So the first thing that I'm working on currently is just the subscription. So the things that I realized the other day is that this protocol, which Apollo has written down, is not just about subscriptions. It's also about all the other operations you can make, like the mutations and the queries. And the only thing that happens is that the stream, so to say, completes once the query gets resolved. And for me personally, and the thing that I want to ask you all is, how often is this actually used? How often do you use a real-time stateless socket to communicate operations which are just like request response?
So I think that queries and mutations are reasonably common over WebSocket connections, partly from before HTTP 2, where there was quite a lot of overhead with doing those requests. Particularly, we have like query batching from a few years back, but that's solved really well by just doing it over a WebSocket connection. Now we've got HTTP 2, sure, that solves it in another way, but that very, very low network overhead of WebSockets does make it attractive. That said, I know there are libraries that only support subscriptions over WebSockets and don't support queries and mutations, such as PostGraphQL itself, which I maintain.
I'm not sure that supporting mutations and queries as first-class citizens over WebSockets is necessarily the best long-term idea. For example, like if you look at HTTP 3, and some of the other transports and protocols that have a better way of handling head-of-line blocking for really large requests, you don't really have that level of control that you need over a single WebSocket connection. So I think this is something that's going to definitely work at a small scale, but as you get to really, really large scale, you're going to start to see some fraying at the edges.
Yeah, so for me, I see the overhead of maintaining the actual socket connection, because you have to worry that you are still connected, that you're not kicked out because of various reasons like losing a network or something like that. So like having this overhead of maintaining actual sockets to just do queries and to do mutations, like just the two operations without the subscriptions part, I don't know how to balance that out. So the questions why I'm asking this is because I'm currently writing this library, and I started by implementing the client side, and I'm thinking of writing a protocol which just describes subscriptions and relying on, say, HTTP 2 or HTTP 3 on having batched queries like Benji has suggested or something like that, and just keeping the subscriptions and keeping the WebSocket, the socket itself, for real time.
That seems reasonable to me. I know that's how Facebook, their setup works that way. They maintain stateless requests over HTTP while they have their real-time data coming in. I don't know if they still use MQTT or if they're fully switched to WebSockets, but they've got a real-time connection that's only used for subscriptions live data.
They had MQTT over WebSockets, so it's best of both worlds. Cool. But another thing, I mean, this is just kind of surrounding context, not necessarily answering your question. But the other reason why you don't necessarily want to merge the two onto a single transport is because they have different scaling characteristics, right? So scaling a real-time gateway looks very different from scaling a stateless request response API tier, because the stateless request response API tier scales horizontally. But the real-time gateway needs some sort of map of, here are all the browsers or your mobile instances that are connected via whatever WebSockets, and then you have to have some fan-out solution. So it just architecturally looks different, which is one of the reasons why Facebook didn't merge the two and run everything over one connection. And I think what I would want to see is some strong case to be made. Like I think. And maybe I'm being, maybe I'm overreaching here, but I think people who start off, they look at like, oh, okay, why do I have to do regular HTTP for request response, and then WebSockets or SSE or whatever for live queries and subscriptions? Why can't I just put everything on a single channel? Isn't that cleaner? Isn't that more efficient? And what I would want to see is some real evidence that is causing a bottleneck somewhere. That is something that is, so for example, there are real problems with that, right? There are real problems where it's very common to do things like, I'm going to send a mutation and then I'm going to subscribe to the result because the result is a stream. And what happens when you do that across two different transports is that you have a race condition. And if you can have some sort of like like atomic ordering of receive and act across a single transport, then you avoid that kind of thing, which I think is a powerful scenario. But that's the kind of argument I would want to see in order to say, hey, look, the really strong recommendation is consolidate everything onto a single transport.
The GraphQL spec has traditionally remained kind of agnostic of transport level concerns, especially around subscriptions. And I think a lot of that is because these scaling concerns are not one size fits all. For a lot of use cases, you're never going to need to scale, and so you can do things that are maybe simpler to implement. So the question is kind of as the scope of this working group. There is the over HTTP separate working group. Would this fall under that? Would that be
Yes.
a good thing to take on, or is this even kind of distinct from that if we're talking specifically about WebSockets?
So with regard to the HTTP spec working group, I think that that's why we're effectively here asking this question, why Denis is here, to gather more information to give the HTTP spec working group more context. I think this won't be in like the version 1 of the HTTP spec, because that's generally only to cover the existing like query and mutation use cases. But I think we're keen to add it afterwards, and the staleness and the security issues in the existing WebSocket implementations need to be addressed in a very clean way, which is why we'd like to know more about how people are implementing this so that we can make sure that we don't write up in a spec any of these mistakes, for example.
Yeah, I think the security issues are a really good point. I think, for example, we could make a case that this is a core infrastructure project that we should bring under the umbrella ownership of the foundation. It seems to me like without I do think this particular repo that you linked, Denis, is the de facto solution, right? Because it's kind of the one that is in all of the documentation and the examples, especially around the Apollo stack. And so given that, I think what we'll see is just generally organic adoption using this library. And to the extent that this library includes a critical security problem, we should definitely address that, either by working with the maintainer. Do you know the maintainer?
There is no maintainer at the moment. Me and Uri was part of the initial implementation about 2 years ago. I think when Lee added the async iterable. Since then, Apollo was working on that. It's not highly maintained at the moment. It does work, and personally, I wouldn't define it as like production ready, especially because of the security concerns and the way that some use cases are not handled correctly. Mostly around security, authentication over WebSockets. It might be a bit tricky in some cases. And I think in terms of documentation, this library lacks some, because people are treating it as GraphQL WebSocket transport instead of subscriptions transport. And as you said, abusing it and using queries and mutations over that WebSocket. Yeah, it leads to a stateless server, and and including the security concerns. I think, people should think again.
Yeah, it's kind of
weird. And it's not a matter of like bad implementation or something like that. I think it's just a matter of maintenance and updating dependencies, making the protocol a bit more robust. So this is definitely something that the community can improve.
So is this something that needs the level of oversight where we fold it into the organization somehow?
Well, I wouldn't think so. I think it's still things that should be discussed at the GraphQL over HTTP thing, because we should be looking at the security implications first and then discussing the other things. Like, for example, what's happening also in the subscriptions transport WS library, which is currently used by almost everyone, is that they are kind of manipulating errors or they're swallowing them. And then you are getting weird things where the first thing that I did, because I reminisced the point in time when I was trying to implement this. And the first thing I did is I kind of wrote my own WebSocket thing, which I would put into the subscriptions transport library to actually read the errors out, because I wasn't even getting any, because of, I don't know what the actual reason was. So I was already doing a lot of work just to get the basics working. And I understand that the security implications are kind of difficult to solve, especially because you cannot set custom headers when you want to initialize and upgrade an HTTP to a WebSocket communication protocol. And you can use the URL, sure, you can send, say, a JWT token through the URL, but we still have to be aware that even if you are communicating through a secure network using SSL or TLS, the URLs are still exposed and people can see them. So my initial approach to this was to still use the initial message, like the connection initialize, and pass through the connection parameters to that, but kick the client off as soon as something feels wrong, or even if the timeout is happening. So if you connect to a server, say, and the client is just staying there, consuming resources, doing no connection initializations, it just would be kicked off after a specific timeout. And this actually is a good segue to another question that I have, and I would like it to be answered in terms of how if you know how many people are actually conforming to the current existing protocol that has been written, and how much wiggle room do I have to kind of manipulate the protocol, because I would like to rewrite it from scratch. It wouldn't just be a refresh. I would like to approach this really seriously through RFCs and communications and discussions and whatever, and just solve this properly, and then allow implementations to live on top of the protocol, and the protocol being the starting point of it.
I think you should do that. The spec itself says very little about the protocol. So the spec itself just talks about the abstraction mechanics of how a GraphQL server and a GraphQL client would communicate upstream. So as long as you're not going so far outside the bounds that it's outside of the spec compliance, actually, even then, if you find that actually the right thing to do is counter or slightly askew from what the spec suggests.
Yeah, I just want to. I thought maybe you understand me wrong. I'm not talking I'm not talking about the spec of GraphQL. I'm talking about protocol that have been implemented by subscriptions by Apple.
Yes. That protocol was written when we wrote the library. The only link to that protocol is between the client for subscriptions and the server for the subscriptions, which are in the same library. So the subscriptions client and the subscriptions server, they are the only two parts that are aware of this protocol. So I think from my point of view, you can feel free to break it and rewrite it from scratch and do whatever you want with it, because it could be improved a lot. And as you said, error handling is not that good at the moment.
So the fact is that it can be improved a lot, but I have a feeling that servers follow this protocol and might even make custom implementations of them, but the client is kind of broken. So what felt natural for me is when I started working on this library, the first thing that I did is I implemented the client side of it, leaving the servers to comply and conform to the protocol that's already existing. So how big of a breaking change would this be where, I don't know, people would get kicked off because in the current protocol specifications, you can still have the socket long living, even though you get errors or the connection cannot be established. And it would be a pretty radical change in what I kind of envision in my head.
I think it comes in both sides. I mean, if you're using subscriptions, this specific library for subscriptions on the server, you're using the same one for the client.
Yeah.
So I think it won't be a breaking change. I mean, it does a breaking change, but all people that are using it for front end will use the same library for the backend, because it comes together with the same typings library and everything else related to it. So I think in terms of the protocol, this is something that could be changed.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think you should feel free to run with it. I noticed your example on the front page of that repo showing how to link it up with Relay. It's exactly why Relay was assembled that way, to make it easy to stick whatever kind of protocol level piece that you want on top of that network transport, is to be able to support lots of different modes. I know Facebook internally does not implement the Apollo WebSocket spec. It looks completely different because they have a completely different service, and it probably won't look anything like what you're doing next either. And that like seam between the clients, GraphQL clients, and then the actual protocol implementations is intentional to provide the flexibility to explore new stuff. One thing that you might consider though, and this would just be pure value add, not necessarily a constraint or a limitation, is if you want to pitch this as an improvement or something that you should use instead of this existing subscriptions protocol spec, then perhaps there's a migration path, right? Because like if you have to have both the server and the client on board to make this work, then like which do you change first? Do you change the server and break the client? Or do you change the client, which then can't talk to your server? Do you set up a second server with a different URL? Like just having some kind of explanation about like, okay, so I've just told you that there's security problems and there's other kinds of problems, and here's the thing that solves that. Here's how you would adopt it if you're already using that other thing. I think that'll actually be useful in terms of helping people get to the place that you want them to be. But if you find that that's kind of at an impasse and it's pretty tough to do that, then that might be okay. Even just saying here's like a counter example that solves these problems is still probably worthwhile.
So what I have in mind is kind of keeping the server API almost the same. So I would still suggest, and I would still write a migration script where you would transfer your existing library from the subscriptions thingy to the library that I'm writing. But I wouldn't have a middle solution. So it wouldn't be something, okay, you can use the server part being from the old library and use the client part, which is from my own, because this just opens more security issues and problems that basically have to be maintained and solved. And let's say have code smell inside of it, because I'm kind of maintaining the thing that's been stale for like 3 years now.
Dennis, I think you're really onto something. This definitely needs work. I mean, if there are security issues with respect to upgrading, then that's probably the P0 to tackle. But yeah, I think starting, okay, without tackling the issue of how you do this incrementally, just for a moment, I recommend thinking about this as 3 separate layers. The one is the transport layer, and the second is the protocol layer, and the third is the GraphQL payload itself. And so let's really quickly think of some examples of variations, because if you have to do this for like, you know, protocol on top of Comet, you're going to get this combinatorial explosion. It's best to just specify this protocol that says, look, whatever it is, whatever transport layer, whatever bidirectional stateful transport layer can do this, or fake the appearance of a bidirectional transport layer. Here's the protocol that goes across it, right? And this is the thing that, you're right, this is the thing that's not in the spec. That'll say things like connection open, connection closed, connection suspended, payload received, you know, send subscription, that kind of thing, right? But I suggest separating that from the protocol itself, right? So in other words, you could have a scenario where your WebSocket connection to the gateway is totally fine and healthy. You can ping and you can receive ACKs all day, but when you send a subscription, maybe there's something behind that tier where the subscription server itself is under heavy load and is dropping payloads. And you want to be able to communicate that fact and say something like, this particular stream is in a suspended state, right? So those are things that I think should be going to the payload. And those are the things that we intentionally left out of the spec. But you also don't want to couple that to a particular transport, because, you know, transports are going to come and go, and people are going to have infrastructure constraints about what transports they can support. So I think maybe the first step forward is to kind of take a look at what you can do to extract the protocol and write a spec around the protocol, or a mini spec. I don't think this should be a heavyweight process, but just to say something like, look, there's some notion of a request followed by a response stream. And examples of these we know of are subscriptions and live queries. And, you know, if you kind of tilt your head a little bit, defer and stream, right? But then you have this protocol that can express this and that can tell the client, look, what you should do is you should now expect a stream of results to follow. It should be able to tell the client something like, you should expect that, but we're pausing your stream for whatever reason, maybe bandwidth constraints, maybe whatever, right? It needs to be able to do something like that. It needs to be able to handle errors of some sort. And then of course it needs to be able to deliver the healthy payloads. But if you can specify that and use that as a common, so imagine that, you know, you can wrap that in maybe something like async iterable, but you have the ability to reconstitute that protocol into some sort of language specific, you know, maybe it's an RX stream, maybe it's an async iterable, maybe it's you know, maybe it's callbacks, who knows, right? But am I making any sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does this answer all the questions that you have?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it. So I wrote a few notes from here. So I would just like to share that my next steps would be actually doing the protocol first and then the implementation. I would also write migrations where you would transfer from the existing subscriptions thing that has not been maintained by Apollo to this library itself. And yeah, kicking it out from there. So feel free to, there is an RFC about the new protocol that I've been thinking about. It's pretty strict and it takes the security implications, as a first-class citizen. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Absolutely. Glad that you're digging into this.
One last explicit question on this. For people that are not using the subscriptions transport WS from Apollo, for example, in other languages or other such things, what are you using for WebSocket connections? Maybe you could share that with Denis.
At Netflix, I'm supporting two things. Server sent events is kind of the large scale thing that works well with our layer 7 proxy. That's one of the main reasons. And so there is an open source client library for that in JavaScript where we actually we forked that internally. And so
share it here in the chat or tell me how to look it up.
The open source module. You can Google it pretty easily, I think. But yeah, I could find that. But yeah, we ended up forking that actually is the version we're using. We could probably open source that if there's interest. And then for WebSockets, we, on the server side, it's not written in JavaScript, so it doesn't use this library. But on the client side, we are matching this protocol. And the reason is purely to be able to use GraphQL off the shelf. Because it's really nice to be able to leverage that for developer use case. And for that use case, it doesn't need to scale, really. And so, and security concerns aren't as much. It's inside of a VPN also. And so there is some value in just having this kind of canonical implementation that fits with the tooling like GraphQL, even if it's maybe not what you would use at the larger scale.
Okay, thanks.
Would you like it if GraphQL supported server sent events?
Yeah, that'd be great too.
Okay.
Good to know. I know Facebook's still, and this is a quirky implementation detail, but there's still MQTT over WebSockets. I believe that's still the case. And that's in part for historical reasons, because their original real-time service was all built in terms of MQTT. And then when it became clear that WebSockets was the preferred low-level protocol for communicating with the browsers. So I think it does straight MQTT to mobile devices, but it does MQTT over WebSockets to browsers. I'm pretty sure that's still correct.
Lee, all you need to do is fire up that really old build you have on your 2009 iPhone.
Oh yeah.
And then hook it up to a network monitor and see what's going across.
That one's pre-MQTT, I believe.
Really?
I thought I'd seen
Facebook supported, right?
What did you say, Stephen?
I thought I'd seen Facebook using long polling in the browser not too long ago. Is that?
They also do that in some cases. There's they do both, and it depends on the particular kind of thing that they're subscribing to. because they're backed by different services. And in some cases, long polling is the more efficient way to do it. And in some cases, actual real-time push. So I believe chat messaging, that entire backend is end-to-end async pushy. But there's other things that are like subscribing to changes on objects where a polling model is actually more efficient.
Yeah. And as an example of the necessity for creating an abstract protocol on top of different transports, I mean, I think Stephen brought up a really good point, right? Like SSE is a different transport versus WebSockets, but it would be kind of a pain to deal with a slight variation in protocol just because you have that one difference. And even in the Facebook case, live queries goes over R sockets, for example. So you know, these are largely like at the developer level, at the API level, you don't want these details to leak through if you can avoid it.
Yeah. Okay, well, in the sake of time, we should keep moving, but Denis, let us know if you have any other open questions that you need answered. You can always do that async over Slack as well.
All right.
Let's talk about TypeScript. Dotan.
Thanks, Lee. So the first issue I wanted to talk about is the ability to use TypeScript type inference for the result type and variables type in TypeScript. I think the best way to show what I mean is, wait, I'll do a screen share. Yep, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, the VS Code screen, yeah, okay. So basically, the concept that we had is to take the basic document node and add two generics to it. So the basic idea is to take, this is how it looks like. So document node with two generics means that these are bundled into the type itself and burned into the instance that we're using. This is just a parsed query. And I'm using a patched version of GraphQL to have this supported. So the idea is that just by passing this object, this typed document node, TypeScript is able to type the result type and the variables type. So I don't need to specify anything here for the types generics. I can just take result and then have everything out of it just like that. Behind the scenes, I'm using GraphQL Codegen to generate the signature of the result type and the variables type. But the idea is that this could be typed manually or by any other solution. It could be even integrated into IDEs to have this supported inline. This is already available with if you're using Bubble for Bubble with Codegen. So this comes in line. So the idea is you can have this typed variables are also typed because everything is inferred from the original object. So I don't need to do anything else to get this kind of type validation. In terms of implementation, this is fairly simple. I opened a PR for GraphQL.js for adding support to it. It basically means that we're taking the default methods that are accessing the document node object, and we type them all across the way until the result type. And then TypeScript is being able to infer that and have it automatically typed. Nothing here is breaking in terms of like the changes and how it affects, because we can have a default object, so everything else should work the same way. There is no spec issue for that, because this is fairly specific to TypeScript and GraphQL.js. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. This is not final. I mean, there are like a few more things to think on. For example, GraphQL Codegen is able to tell if variables are needed at all, or they could be optional. So this and the maybe could be moved into the infer type, but this is a breaking change, so that's why I didn't include it in the original PR. Yeah, that's it.
I was experimenting with this the other day, and I thought it was amazing. One thing I was wondering about when implementing it, I couldn't seem to figure out how to get it working with queries that were not defined in GraphQL files.
So that's why I said that this could be improved a lot. In terms of IDE support, for example, if you're using Babel to compile your TypeScript, there is a library that uses GraphQL Codegen to provide inline typings on the fly, and this works with the Babel plugin for VS Code, so it works pretty nice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so and GraphQL Codegen can extract the operations for you, but then it won't work. It's a bit tricky. The ideal way to use it is if you have your operations written in a .graphql file, then GraphQL Codegen can pick it up, pre-compile it, and create this type document node for you. Yeah, but this could work, as I said, with manual typing if someone wants to do it. And the Apollo client merged the PR for adding support to it on the upcoming version. So I think this could be the standard for making TypeScript and GraphQL play nice together. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to make sure of, though, so I've been spending a lot of time on embedded GraphQL support in different languages like TypeScript and JavaScript for VS Code GraphQL, about to launch a bunch, about to release a bunch of new features for embedded TypeScript support. And so as long as we have some kind of like some kind of tag template or some kind of pattern like that, then it makes it very easy to highlight GraphQL inline and to add language features and, you know, completion and stuff like that. So as long, I'm just worried that this tool will lead to people just not using, but I guess I can't foresee how, like, I guess you would have to change how your applications are organized to use GraphQL files more, at least how it stands now. But wherever it goes, it'd be cool, even if it's just like a pass-through tag template function or something like that, you know. It just makes it easier to detect. That's all.
Yeah, think about if your, for example, your GraphQL operations are inlined and in like your component file, and it's easier for you. So you eventually do some kind of a manipulation. It's either using parse or GraphQL tag or whatever to compile it. So
well, I know that. That's why I'm suggesting it should just be like a pass-through. Since your tooling's already doing the parsing, you know, the GraphQL tag already was, that there'd be some kind of like a simple pass-through function just to denote that you're looking at a GraphQL string. Because otherwise, all the VS Code extensions won't be able to support the.
Yep. Yeah, you're right.
GraphQL. And with Gatsby, like our main use case is with queries in the components. So.
Yeah, so I'll share some links in a minute, but I mean, there is a way to do that only with Babel at the moment, but I think this could be, you're right, maybe this could be path through, and then you can have the types built in based on the operations that you already have.
Right. Concerning the breakage with the added generic types, could you just add defaults to alleviate that? Since
yeah, so we have defaults here.
Oh, I see.
Got it. It's defaulted here, and this is like how the so we published a library that extends the basic document node and gives those patches for patching libraries. So this is how it looks like. So it's defaulted all across the way. So it shouldn't be any breaking changes for anyone.
I see.
This looks great. I mean, as long as there's no breaking change, A, which you've covered, and B, the developer experience of actually using these types is at worst the same, then there's no downside, right? Like this is not saying that you have to use these in order to supply types. This is just yet another way to incorporate generated types in with the core componentry of how GraphQL executes. So it's providing additional information to the execute function. That seems like a pure win to me. The only potential downside is additional complexity, but even then this diff is not particularly large. So I think even then the cost is quite small. So from my point of view, this looks great. I think it's just a matter of you and Ivan making sure you get through the code review process and get it in place. I know there's also some progress that I know you're involved with and doing the TypeScript migration overall. So there's some complication there, but you and Ivan are much more informed about how to handle that than I am.
Thanks.
Yes, so to provide some points. I actually feel like we need to set up separate call for GraphQL.js, discussing GraphQL.js stuff, because obviously not everybody on working group using JavaScript or interested in implementation details. But at the same time, it's proves the point that we need to some way to communicate. So I will, and since I have access to Zoom, GraphQL Zoom, I will set up GraphQL.js, call, and we can discuss technical details. One thing I want to note that we already have a similar thing. Basically, when we adopt TypeScript typings from defaultly typed, they had template parameter for execute, GraphQL, and subscribe. So like, for example, it cannot be like just execute, it should be subscribe, it should be GraphQL function. So like surface is bigger. So my issue I want to discuss here, and it's, I think it's important to discuss actually in this group, is how TypeScript specific should GraphQL.js be, because it's not only this issue. Obviously, this issue is not portable to other languages, because especially static type language, you cannot port it. And so this issue, and people constantly open similar issues, adding stuff. For example, like inferring resolver types from resolvers into schema itself. It was like suggestion by Mike to create like something like GraphQL Nexus, like type inference for. And as Lee said, I'm also worried about becoming too TypeScript specific, especially like my biggest question for this functionality, why it cannot be separate function called typed execute.
I'm not sure that it's matter. I mean, just extending the same one without affecting the signature at all. So I don't see any reason to type it again.
So we like adding, for example, adding arguments to node, or to document nodes. So document node becoming not just a node, but node plus some type information. So I'm like, I feel like if we merge this one, like people would suggest other TypeScript specific functionality. So I'm like, so especially like my point was always that types should reflect runtime behavior. And since we cannot guarantee that we return with value by GraphQL.js itself, so GraphQL.js cannot ensure that return value will be matching. It's ensured by CodeGem, not by GraphQL.js. So it's basically like glorified type conversion. So I'm like, so my point is that I'm kind of on the fence of going too much TypeScript. I'm totally TypeScript specific. I'm totally, or tooling specific. I'm totally open to add hooks.
I'm going to suggest, first of all, we should absolutely set up a GraphQL.js specific call. I think that'll be really worthwhile because there's a lot of detailed stuff to dig into. Let's do that. Secondly, I think we need to address each of these cases individually rather than thinking about it as like an overall rule. Yes, it's reasonable to be concerned that we get too TypeScript specific and we end up with a lot of like narrow functionality that is hard to extend. But I think we can apply that on a per case basis. So in this particular case, it seems like nothing is lost and only like there's the behavior of the TypeScript type remains equivalent if you do not provide additional information, but you can, and there are packages that want to consume those types and add that information and use the execute function in a way that provides additional type detail. That seems like a pure win with little downside. Now I agree with you that I would not take that to the extreme that we would say TypeScript type generation should live in GraphQL.js, because the types that you generate are going to be different depending what the thing is you want to do. And Apollo client generates its types differently from how the Relay client does, which would be different from how you would generate them in a bunch of other scenarios. And providing the flexibility to do those in different ways is a worthwhile thing. So I would suggest the lens that we use is enable changes to TypeScript that provide capability, like hooks, but not in cases that narrow those capabilities by hard coding the like one particular way to do things. And hopefully that helps us navigate this. But if there's particular cases where we want to like noodle out how those two guidances come together, then we can do that on a GraphQL.js call.
Yeah, just a side note, the major benefit of this feature is not GraphQL.js. It's all the client libraries that are consuming document node from GraphQL.js, because they will get free typings and type inference for hooks, components, higher order components. It doesn't matter how they are querying the data. So that's the major benefit. It's there.
Nice. Well, in the sake of time, let's keep moving. I know you also wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the migration plan overall and the next steps.
Okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a bit about the next steps and what should we do next in terms of TypeScript migration in GraphQL.js. I'll try to keep it short. So far, we are following the plan that Ivan wrote. It's going great, and we are having some nice progress in GraphQL.js and Express GraphQL and some others. So this is nice progress, but I think we can maybe rethink this or maybe rethink the next steps, and maybe this should be, we can break it down to smaller tasks, and then the community can take part on this migration. Personally, I had some time and I started to put some effort to migrate tests, linting, and some stuff related to it. Yeah, and I'm willing to put some more effort. Just wanted to bring this up to hear what are your thoughts, and if this is something that is important for others as it's important for us. Because if so, we are on board on doing this migration.
So I feel like I need to address it. because we basically made decision to switch to TypeScript a year ago, and everybody was involved, like APOA, and so I feel like core issue here, I'm basically a bottleneck for a lot of this stuff. And it's not only like help from community, it's actually reviewing. As Andy said, initially we have like very high bar for code quality, for standards. And so basically it means I review every code line, and it's like a lot of effort, especially like for mass conversion. So on the technical side, like I trying to figure out ways how to separate syntax changing from meaningful changes, because like syntax changes, you don't need to review everyone for meaningful changes. You need to, but core issue here is like buzz factor. Especially I'm experienced it this month. I had a knee surgery, so I was in hospital and stuff, so I wasn't communicating or managing stuff, and it's blocked a bunch of people, including like stream and defer effort and other efforts. So general solution to that is I'm trying to onboard new maintainers to scale up preview process. So Daniel, we start working like a couple of months ago with him, and he helps a lot, and I give him triage rights as the first step. And we discussed it, and he actually wants to become maintainer. So I'm in process of that. Another, I have like Google Summer of Code student. He is less experienced, but hopefully he like can also take some share work. So basically, for me, I'm totally for TypeScript conversion, and I think like it's already decided in a sense. Issue here is review capability. It's not even like help from community. It's like, as you said, like you have open PRs, and people constantly suggesting help with some aspects, especially for things like TypeScript. Yeah, it's not architectural work. Just
we can help with this.
Yeah, let's start to put a plan together for improving the bus factor. Here's my concrete suggestions. Let's first of all set up that GraphQL.js specific call. I think it'll be useful to have a time, probably monthly, where more progress will happen between those calls, but it's just like an opportunity for all of us to get together synchronously and talk about these kinds of things. We can keep them also kind of focused on these, like not specific code that we're trying to get in, but like strategy. And another thing we should start to do, and maybe Yvonne, you and I can work on this, is list out contributors to GraphQL.js and decide, here's the ones that we want to consider owners. Like right now, in the past, it's been you and me, and now it's more just you alone. What other people do we want to consider like trusted reviewers with merge capabilities? And what other ones do we want to start to like move along on that path? So people who we can give review capabilities, but not necessarily merge capabilities. And we can start to build a plan for how to move more people along that path. You never want to get to the point where you have like a zillion reviewers, because you'll lose that shared vision. But as long as you keep it a tight core set of people, like a couple, and they're in constant communication, then I think that process tends to work very well for open source projects. So I think we can get ourselves there and reduce the bus factor.
Yeah, so I'm actually like doing it right now with 2 people. So I think
nice.
It's enough for, it's like, it's half my time. So like I have less time to write code on my own, and it's normal. It's always happened like that. But I don't feel like I have capacity to onboard more maintainers, especially since in autumn we should get like summer of season of documentation technical writer and work with him. So I actually think like we'll have initial batch, and at the same time I don't feel like we need to formalize it too much, because like we're learning a lot at the same time. It's like switching from one maintainer to two maintainer is bigger experience than switching from 2 to 3.
Right.
So especially since I discussed this with Daniel, an idea is after I onboard him, for him to choose a person to work with and onboard. So I basically want to do chain, and I discussed with him, and he knows that it's a plan. So like after I onboard Daniel choose somebody who he feel comfortable to work with or help with PRs. So it's a plan.
Okay.
Yeah, oh, the call definitely.
Yeah, let's set up the call first, and the rest, Ivan, you and I can figure out offline. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to dig into the tag type RFC. So let's move on and talk about that next. Benji, it's all you. Benji, you still there?
Yeah, hey, sorry, I just went to grab a glass of water, so
no worries.
Moved on from that just slightly faster than I expected. Hello. Cool. So, as we discussed last working group, we made progress on the input unions and decided that possibly the tagged type was one of the leading ideas there. So I've taken some time to write up a draft RFC for that, which is linked from the agenda. Broadly, the tag type is very interesting. It's the first type that's not a wrapper type, such as the list type or non-null, where it can be valid for both input and output. And it's actually defined based on what its fields are. So if its fields are all input types, then it will be valid for input. If its fields are all output types, then it will be valid for output. So if it were a scalar only type, where all of the fields, or what we're calling members, were all scalars, then it would be valid for both input and output, which is quite interesting. I've outlined the changes that I think would be necessary to the spec based on this, broadly inspired by the union type, basically. So I've gone through, seen where the union type is used and referenced that, and also input objects. We've discussed before effectively what the tagged type is, but as a summary, the tag type will be a new type introduced to GraphQL. It will be made up of a number of members, at least one member. The members are effectively like fields that you would find on output types or on, object types or input types. They'll have an associated type with them, just like the other fields would have. They currently don't accept arguments. I don't think they ever will. They currently don't accept directives, but that may or may not change. I can imagine that the skip and include directives might be useful for them potentially. The idea is you would request, so for querying, you would request a selection set like you normally would, and you would get back you would get back exactly one of those fields. All the other ones won't be null, they will literally not be present, as if they had been skipped with the skip directive. Similarly, on inputs, we would require that the input would match as well. So we'd say, here are all the fields we accept, but only one of them may be present in an input object that is sent through. There were a few questions around this. I've actually chatted a few of them over with the working group and also Lee separately. Things such as, should it actually be a separate type, or should it be one of the existing types with like the one field directive, which is what was originally proposed well over a year ago. And there's good reasons for it to be a separate type. Namely, it enables us to evolve the type in a separate way. It also doesn't really have as much in common with the other fields as you might at first think. So things like, you know, not having arguments and other such things make it so it is different. One interesting open question on it at the moment for me is how it behaves with regard to nullability and the non-null constraint. Specifically, how I originally imagined it would be that there would be one field and that field would be non-nullable. So you'd end up either with a null result for the entire tagged type, or you'd end up with something with a field and that field having a non-null value. However, that's been, we've discussed this, and I think it's not necessarily the best plan at the moment, because if we don't require that, then we enable to use more of the shared logic between the other types. So we can throw an error and have that caught at the relevant boundary rather than raising it up that extra level through the tagged type. An interesting divergence from GraphQL currently is, at the moment in GraphQL, when you query any selection set, you can add a _ type name to it, and that will still be true. But previously, any time that a _ type name was returned, it would always refer to an object type. So if you queried it on a union or an interface, it would still give you the underlying concrete object's type. And now it would also give you the tagged type name if you were to query it in that part of the selection set. It's been added there just to make sure that we maintain compatibility with all the clients, because they may not know whether it's a tag type or not. So allowing them to query it there works well. And I think it's generally beneficial. Another option there would be to potentially return like what the expected type of that thing would be, but that opens a number of problems, particularly with regard to saying, well, if this says it's a cat, but actually the child field under it is a cat, then we're being confusing there, because we're expecting certain fields to be present which are not. So using the tag type name there definitely makes more sense. One interesting thing, because it can be valid for input and output, but it might not be. So if it had only input fields, you couldn't use it on an output, for example. I think we could look at adding to introspection into the _ type a shortcut field for is input type and is output type based on the spec algorithm of is it an input type, is it an output type? And that would be helpful to clients, I think. At the moment, to determine whether a tagged union is an input type or an output type, you have to not only look at its fields, but you have to look at their fields and their fields all the way down the tree. If a tag type refers to another tag type as one of its fields, then you'd have to see whether that one's an input or an output, and all the way down the tree, which could potentially be more expensive than need be, especially since the schema will know that already, or could potentially cache it. But that said, we can merge it without that. So we've left that out of this spec, and that could be a follow-up spec. Another interesting question on it is, should we allow field aliases? So if you say that this tagged type can only have one field set, and say you've got cat and dog, should you be able to alias cat to feline, for example? Is that an okay thing to do? Can you refer to the same field more than once? Feline : cat, and also cat : cat. Is that okay to do? And so far, the RFC that I've raised doesn't put any restrictions on that. You can do it the same as you would with any other selection set. And I think that's probably the correct direction. But it is an interesting question that probably warrants discussion. So that was rather a lot of information. Does anyone have some questions that they'd like to ask?
The one thing you didn't address here, but I probably can anticipate your opinion, is should you be able to put a fragment spread within a tag type?
Yes, I think you should. I've not put any restrictions with regard to fragment spreads on tag types, and I think that's a perfectly valid thing to do. It allows you to, if you can then keep in one location what all the possibilities of a tag type are, and then every time you refer to it, just splat out that that fragment, which I think is beneficial.
Can you quickly explain? I see this RFC for the first time. I followed the input discussion a little bit, but so the fundamental idea is that you can always only return or provide exactly one of the fields in a tag type. Is this a gist? Is this correct?
Yes, that's exactly correct. Yes.
And one of the immediate concerns or like immediate confusion from my side is like the breaking change of the type name thing. Like type name returning objects is actually a really fundamental aspect of GraphQL, and a lot of semantics implicitly rely on this. So like breaking this, I'm wondering, like, yeah, that's a big change. Like. This has an impact on a quite of different aspects, I think. Not saying that's the wrong thing to do, but it is a big change.
There's a hard trade-off here, Andy. I'm curious what your opinion is, honestly, because there's two kind of long-standing assumptions to how GraphQL works, that one of which we will have to break. One of them is one that you just said, which is anytime you ask for type name, you always get an object type name back.
Yeah.
The other one is that anywhere you see a curly braced typeset, you can always ask for dunder type name. So if you ask for dunder type name on a tag type, then presumably you should get the name of that type, which is not an object type. Or do we make it so that this is one of the places where you are not allowed to ask for dunder type name?
So in my opinion, the approach of doing what I've done in the RFC is the right approach. The reason for that being that many pieces of tooling that issue queries don't actually know what the schema is. So for example, Apollo client doesn't generally care what this schema actually is. So it adds the dunder type name throughout your queries automatically. And preventing that from being the case, I think, is going to cause a lot of effort, a big lift for people using GraphQL. I'm interested to know what you think would actually break with regard to returning the tagged type for dunder type name.
It's maybe breaking was not the correct word, because you introduce new concepts, right? Like you can't. It's not like you change the semantic of the existing underscore type name. It's more like you like there's a concept, and I think actually there's a concept of, we call it normalized queries, which is basically a pre-analyzed query, which kind of lets you expand all the different aspects of a query to. This is actually what comes down at the when you execute it in terms of objects. So you can expand all fragments, all unions, all interfaces, and kind of pre-analyze the whole query, and you can get away with actually these are the 5 possible object types that could be returned. And this is like I'm thinking in this direction, that it changes this way of how you can analyze a query overall. because you introduce a real new type, and I'm not sure yet about the implications. I'm just thinking it's a big step. Yeah, like it's a big change for GraphQL.
Yeah, adding a new type is definitely a big change anyway, but I think it's something that we need to do for input polymorphism, and the symmetry.
I'm all for evolving. I'm all for evolving. Sorry, just to get this out of the way. Like, I'm not criticizing the fundamental aspect here. Sorry, go ahead.
I was able to implement it all the way up to graphical before. The original input union RFC from like almost 2 years ago, I think. So I'm aware, at least from my end, from the IDE tooling, LSP, VS Code extensions, and graphical code mirror end of things, what the effort is. And it's a new keyword. Yeah, it's a new type. That's all. That's a lot. Yeah, it's not easy, but it's worth it, I think.
Yeah,
Part of why I got started.
Another interesting feature of it is, as I say, we're currently calling these fields members, and that's because we already have fields which are used for output types, and we already have input fields which are used for input types. Input fields are much more similar to the tagged fields in that they don't support arguments, for example. But again, if we wanted to evolve input fields in future, that might cause issues if we were to tie the members of a tag type and the input fields of an input type together. So again, we go with a separate additional thing, which means now the introspection schema, introspection query is a bit bigger. Tooling has now 3 branches through there to get the relevant fields. But I think the trade-offs are worth it in regard to enabling the future expansion of GraphQL.
I'm interested, like, I'm looking at your pets example, and like, if you return a single pet, like not a list of pets, and you query like cat and dog. Sorry for this naive understanding, but is this very similar to what you would do with a fragment then? Like, you would get back one of these twos? Like, if you just have like one pet and it's of type tagged, and you query cat and dog, but you only get one back, is this how it would work?
Yes, so imagine that you had an output type, a regular object type, and that had 2 fields on it, cat and dog, and you had an internal constraint that said you may only return one of these. It would be like the result to that, except for whichever key is not specified, is not matched, whichever one would have returned null is actually not present. But other than that, it's the same. So it's the same structure, it's another nested object, but the object will only have the one key.
So like, it would actually really, it's like you would actually, yeah, you would remove the null key you would get if it's a union, for example.
Yes.
Do I get this right?
Yes.
Okay. Just out of my head, I can see the reasoning introducing type name, even if it breaks current assumption, because I think you're right with the like, the clients need to have the ability to ask what comes back. That's very important. I agree with that. That's yeah.
There was also another potential in the earlier discussions we were having around input unions. It's interesting that we've landed here because a lot of the discussion is actually happening around their behavior in the output system, whereas the original problem statement was to handle the input system. That, in my mind, is actually success because it means that we've found something that's generally interesting for both cases and solves problems in both. So that's a great outcome. But relevant to the discussion you're just having, Andy, is we were earlier in the discussion, one of the alternate proposals was thinking about how to provide rough shapes of inputs and match them to the appropriate type in an input union. And one of the suggestions for doing so was to use dunder type name. So you can provide dunder type name as part of your input object and supply the string with the name of the type that you expect that input object actual data to be matched to. And that would also sort of like break this assumption that type name refers explicitly to an object type. In that case, it would refer to an input object type. It's used in a different context, of course, but I think it's interesting that in both cases, we landed on something that started to blur that assumption. So perhaps we need to question whether that assumption is a reasonable one and think more about tactically if there's a breaking change involved with changing it.
Like, one big question is like I remember these proposals where you would specify the type name as an input argument. How is this solved in this proposal? Like, I see like you can detect string filter is used for input and output, and you need to be required to specify exactly one of the fields, and this is the marker what should go in. Is this how it works? Like,
yeah, effectively that. So whereas with the other proposals, you would take your input object and then you would modify that object to insert an extra property. This one instead does it by wrapping it with another object, which then has the key that identifies which thing it is.
I see. Yes.
So it's been a little while since I actually wrote this RFC up, so I'm a little bit fuzzy, but I remember that I did have a hard time deciding exactly the coercion rules for it. So if you've got the RFC open and you were to go to section 3 and then line 1535, which I'll share a link to in chat, wherever chat's gone. There it is. Specifically how it handles where, so this is with regard to I believe this is the input section, right? He says scrolling up. Yeah, this is input coercion, yes. So this is depending on what the user sends through to you, what errors should we raise. So we've made it so that if you say that it is a tag type and you were to specify like A null and B 1, 2, 3, that would explicitly be an error because you have specified more than one key, for example. And where that gets interesting is when it then relates to variables. What if you were to say that your input was where you had variables that reference the keys of the object rather than the tagged type, rather than the entire tagged type itself, and how those are handled? That's where things I think get a bit more interesting. The way that I've specified it, I think, should allow you to do that and to have it do the right thing. What I feel that is the right thing, but it's I think there's going to be quite some interesting debate on that subject.
There's already a relatively nuanced distinction between optionality and nullability. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's the right thing to latch onto here to solve this. But I agree that it's a potential for confusion and frustration if you supply multiple variables. One of them either defaults to null or you provide null or something like that, and it flows through to one of these things, and then it ends up, after you've resolved the variables, becoming exactly the case that you said should explicitly be an error, where one of the fields exists but it is null. Yeah.
At the moment, I've done exactly that. So I've treated optionality and nullability as separate. So you can specify multiple keys as variables, and then exactly one of those variables must be supplied, and the others mustn't be null, but they must be literally not present. It may be clearer if we would, and potentially more flexible and less irritating, if we were actually to go ahead and require that all of the members of a tagged type were non-nullable. That would then make the input and the output of that easier to do. Then for output, you could just say if tagged.a, then you would know that it's there without having to necessarily say, well, if the tagged thing has a key, what is that key? And then look up the property of it, which, is a different thing depending on what language you're programming with, sure.
Would that also impact the evolvability of a tagged type when you're wanting to deprecate or remove fields?
Yeah, deprecation is an interesting one. Because you can query it with a selection set, there may always be a selection set that queries these fields. So you might deprecate one to say like you shouldn't request this anymore, but effectively, so my opinion would be if you deprecate a field, a member of a tag type, then you should never effectively resolve to that tag type having that value, but you should still always accept queries upon it. When it comes to inputs, you should still accept it as an input and you need to handle the relevant thing. But since only one key is present and since all of the members can be non-nullable, I don't think that the nullability ties into the deprecated in quite the same way that it does for object types.
One aspect that also I see here like where we evolve, if I use this nicer term, it's like we have, it's the first time that, well, not the first time maybe, but like it's okay to have, to specify fields and these fields are not present at all in the result without an error, if this is correct, right? You can like, it's
yeah,
like
absolutely. The desired behavior is you would query for as many fields as you're interested in. And also, as you evolve your tagged types, you may well add additional members to them, and older queries will not query for those previous member types. So just like with a union, if you were to add a field to a union, a type to a union, then your code may not handle the situation where that extra type is added and you really need a default case on your switch statement or whatever it is that you're coding with. The same would be true of the tag type. And this is actually an interesting thing I forgot to raise, which is the only way to know what a tag type would be is to explicitly request all of the members of that tag type. If you only request cat and dog, and it actually comes back as a fox, you're going to get an empty object. And it doesn't matter if you request _ type name, you're not going to know that it was a fox and that that's what you should have. Potentially, we could add another introspection field there for like, what should it have been? But I think...
I wonder if this is just a non-problem, right? Because what people are doing right now is using that, if they're using a union type, they're using type name as the key in that switch. And if it comes, like if you said, I'm gonna write a query fragment for cat and a query fragment for dog and not one for fox, then realistically what my generated code look like or manually code looks like is switch, if it's the type name is cat, do this. If the type name is dog, do that. Default, do something else. And it's like not, the fact that it's fox, it might as well have been alien or a bunch of random ASCII characters. Like it doesn't matter. That's all the default case, because presumably at that moment when the query was written, either the author didn't know about fox or it straight up wasn't part of the schema. In which case, who cares if you know what it is or not? So I'm not totally sold that this is a real problem, a problem we're solving. And if it is one, then presumably it'll crop up and we can kind of address it later as a follow-on.
I completely agree. The only difference that I would raise is it's often useful in that default handler to log out, this case was not handled. And that may even be something useful for sending over to like Rollbar or Sentry or some other tracking system. And we wouldn't have the equivalent, unlike we do with unions. But I really, again, don't think it's a big deal, which is why I've not written it into the RFC. And we could always add it later if we need to.
One quick note is that this is very similar to the feature one of in Protos. And so in Proto v3, for example, there is actually a special method that just gets like basically what you're describing through introspection. Just which one of these things is it. So
good to know that exists. Good precedent.
Yeah, like I would entertain the idea that, so the question would be like, tags can only return one of the possible options, very similar to union, right? So so like __ type name could actually include the information what type it is, right, at runtime. So like it could
it
be
could
like,
so you could say, oh, it's a it's a pet object, it's a pet tagged, but it is then a cat. You could,
yes,
but
exactly.
Again, that would be a very different behavior for type name. Normally type name would refer to the name of a type, and tagged is a type. It's represented by dunder type in the introspection. So I would expect to be able to look it up in there. So that would be a very different behavior.
Well, I'm not sure it would be so different, because type name, like interfaces are real types, but they never returned by type name, right? So it's like you just because it's a real type doesn't have to be returned by type name. So it comes down a little bit to, I know it looks a little bit awkward, and I don't have a good solution for this in my mind, but type names so far conveys like the runtime information, what the result of the query is when it's executed. And tag has very similar semantics to union, if I understand correctly. And there is a real type associated to tag, which represents the real query result, right? So there is like, I'm wondering if there's not a possibility, or maybe we should talk about this to enhance this and give it back, that there is this real type of, there is only one type of this tag type returned, and you should be able to query it, if this makes sense.
I think that would be an interesting sort of hack in my mind. I think it would be better to represent that with an additional property if it was needed, because at the moment, whatever you get back from __ type name, you can then look up in the dunder types, in the types schema types record set to find the type with that name. And even if that were to support things other than object types, it would still find a record from that list. If we were to change it to have dot or triangular brackets or whatever else, it would no longer be able to do that. So I think that's more of a breaking change, and it should be represented as a field.
Yeah, one thing about that is if you have object types as the members of the tag type, and you were to query under type name on the tag type and then the object type as well, then you would have the same type twice in the result, which is not a problem per se, but a little bit weird, perhaps.
We certainly couldn't return the object type's name directly, because then we'd be saying effectively this is a cat, and so it has name and number of lives and whatnot, but actually it doesn't. It only has one property, cat. So it must not have the exact same type name, but it could have a derivative.
Do we have restrictions on the members of a text type? Like, must be object types, or not? It does not, obviously you don't, but like, can you make object type and interface types, for example?
They can be interfaces, tagged, unions, input objects, and scalars. And
can be anything, right?
They can be anything. They can be anything.
So we have no restrictions. All the members of a tag type can be anything.
The only restrictions are you can't have like an input type as one field and an output type as another field, because that would make the entire tagged type unrepresentable on either input or output. But that's the only restriction.
Yeah, then it fails both it fails is input type and it fails is output type. If it's false for both, then like technically the type itself makes sense, but you can't use it anywhere. Yeah. That's actually a good call out as we start to think about the like schema validation rules. Like that would be a good schema validation rule to make sure to cover.
It's already in there. It's already in the RFC.
Very
that
nice.
makes me think that it's really unfortunate that we don't have a generic object type that has the same, also allows this mixture of either input types or output types. Because in a way, a tag type is kind of like an object type, but
yeah, we've talked about that so many times. I think this has come up a handful of times in the course of discussing input unions, and then ultimately this tag type. Is part of what we're doing is charting out the rules for how these things could operate. And I know one of the kind of unstated goals Benji has is retaining the option value for such a type in the future. So we don't want to make a design decision now with tag types that would restrict the ability to add the type that you're describing, Benedikt, in the future.
We're sort of calling that type structs at the moment.
Very C++ of us.
I did actually evaluate with Lee specifically the idea of using structs for this because I felt like it could be a good solution, and Lee very rightly shot me down in a large number of ways, pointing out all of the various foibles that it would surface. So yeah, I am convinced that struct is not the right solution for this, but I still think it is a valuable thing to potentially have in future. Partly, to be honest, the main thing that we would lose with struct would be the flexibility of evolving your schema over time. If you want the idea that you can pull down a struct, do something to it, and send it back to the server, you can add new non-nullable types to like an object, non-nullable fields to an object type, and that's fine to evolve the schema over time. But if you were to do that with a struct and you weren't requesting those fields, when you pull it down and when you send it back up again, it wouldn't have those required fields, and that gives you quite a few issues. So for me, that's the most glaring issue with trying to use a struct as a universal pull it down, send it back up thing.
Why would I use unions anymore if I have tags?
That is a great question. And so I've got a few answers to that. Unions and tags solve very similar problems with regard to output, but unions still have some advantages over tags. In particular, fragment spreads, which you can't do in the same way with tags. So for example, you could say, if my union is of type node, like where node is an interface, you can spread over it and request all of the fields that would be valid on node, like ID. You couldn't do that with a tagged type because you can't spread an interface over a tag type. You'd need to request each of the individual types within it and then the fields within those. So there's things like that where it's less of a good fit. I think
sorry, but I don't think you can like union members need to be objects. So I didn't get the example completely about spreading across node.
If there's an overlap between the union and the interface, you can do a fragment spread over the interface. It doesn't have to be a full overlap, so you don't have to have all of the types within Node. Sure. But if one of the things like user is within your union, if you've got user and pet and user implements Node, you can do a spread when you query the union of those two things for Node. And then it says, if it is a node, if it obeys the node interface, you may request these fields, otherwise you can't.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going through my head. and
also, the unions are shallower. Like the tag type adds a level of indirection, so some people will prefer the shallower approach. But broadly, they are similar, and I think that is potentially one of the issues that this introduces, but I don't think it's a good enough reason not to add it, in my opinion.
Like The interesting implications are here actually on the schema design also, like going behind the actual, the technical things. Can we do it? Are there like logical errors? Like the implications of how you would design schemas differently is really interesting. And
for sure, especially if you start out with a tag type that is valid for both input and output. If you were to then want to evolve it over time, you'd never be able to add something that was, say, input only or output only to that tag type. So it may become an anti-pattern to use the exact same tag for both input and output. And it might be better that your arguments accept the input type and that your return types accept a separate but identical output type. That I'm not sure what that will turn into, and it's really, again, up to schema designers to define that and to see what makes sense for them. But it is an interesting thing where the schema evolvability may be penalized if you use a one that's valid for both input and output in both places.
How about... Nah, I just had this kind of nonsensical idea of extending tag types, but I just, like because we have extend type for other types, but I just remembered that those kind of go away at runtime. So never mind.
Ricky, you raised a question in chat. Did you want to raise that over voice?
Oh, I mean, that was just an idea when you were discussing struct. I'm pretty sure, I don't know if this really solves the problem. It's just the idea is that what if input types and object types could share interfaces? That would kind of solve the problem.
So I think the issue there is that interfaces use the output type definition of fields, whereas input types obviously don't support like arguments and things like that. And also their nullability concerns, input versus output, are kind of opposites. So I think that would be problematic.
Also, interfaces are like a subsetting operator, right? Like an interface says this type supports at least these things and may support more, which from an output type makes sense. It means like it is safe to query at least these things, and it might be safe, but we're not sure to query more than that. But from an input point of view, that doesn't give you much, right? Because what you really want to do is invalidate the stuff that's not legal. You want the opposite. Okay. Yeah, you want a supersetting operator, which is what this is.
So I think I like this in general quite a lot. I think the space where I'm have concerns is like the challenge of determining if it's valid for input or output and where those can evolve a type. And it makes me wonder, like, I'm not sure about this, but like, should we consider splitting them so that they're distinct types for both input and output, just to make it a little more clear and remove some of the risk around them? You know, maybe they just have a different name, but they behave 100% the same. They're just like really explicit about where they can be used. Does that close off any option value in the future, or?
I think it might, especially with this. Like, I don't know whether or not we ever will go down the road for structs, but I think it would make that more complex, and you'd end up needing to like fully duplicate your type if you wanted to use it in more than one place. You'd have to have an input and output variant, which by all accounts, all the details of them would be equivalent except the name. That might be a frustration point. So yeah. I think that is like a realistic, like, developer efficiency issue.
What we could potentially do that would be a solution to that, and that is actually one of the open questions that's listed. What we could do instead is just say that once you've used a tag type in an input position, you may not use it in an output position, and just do it as a schema validation rule, which we could always then just delete later if we need to. But I think using separate types would add more complexity. Sorry, Andy.
I think that using a single type is very useful for some cases. For instance, a case where you would basically use the tag type to have a polymorphic scalar. And in that case, I think it would be really common to just pass back the same type as input and output. And also in terms of schema evolution, there's little risk in like adding a like a specific type that's specific for input or output to that.
Reasonable open question. Benji, what more do you need to continue moving forward aside from additional review of the RFC that you've written so far?
I think that the RFC is in a good position, actually. I'm not aware of any issues in it. There are things that are debatable in it, but I think it could be merged as is and it would be valid. I'm not aware of anything that would prevent that from happening. So I'm certainly keen to gather more opinions on various of the open questions, and I would love to have more reviews on it, spotting my obvious mistakes, most likely, because it's a lot of text. When I opened the one field RFC before, that was like, it was like 3 lines of editing the spec. This one's more like duplicating huge chunks of it and updating it. One particular thing where the wording in the spec is more complicated is where we're effectively sharing the same algorithms for tagged and object, or tagged and input type. So in some places in the spec, I've effectively said, for the purposes of this section, a tagged member is called a field, because then we can just use the word field everywhere. And I think we already do that for input fields, though they should technically be called input fields. We just call them fields, and that's fine. But for tagged, we've called them members, and that potentially complicates the wording of those algorithms, even though the actual technical implementation of them is just the same. So help on wording of that would be beneficial.
Can I ask a little bit open-ended, spicy question? What was the reason to extend it actually to the output types? Like I saw a lot of discussions about the initial problems around input unions, and I think they were reasonable and there were a lot of effort. I'm failing to see like what new things offers me to model this for the output types, which I could not do before. Yes, there would be like an indirection, but like I'm failing to see on a very quick look what it would give me for output types that I could not do before.
Yeah, that is absolutely an excellent question, and something that we've discussed quite a bit. Broadly, it comes down to a few things. One is tag types are like easier for beginners to actually query. Like they don't need to worry about fragment spreads. They can just type the names of the fields and have it all autocomplete in a very easy way. But that's kind of by the by. That's not the important one. The important one is the symmetry between input and output types. So you could, with a tagged, represent something that is symmetric. You can pull it down from the output of your schema, manipulate it, and send it straight back up again in its same form. And we have like almost that with input and object types, but obviously those don't support polymorphism. So this would give you a polymorphic version of having that kind of optional symmetry.
So, but that symmetry is only achievable right now with the tag if you use a scalar for every value.
Or if you use types that are both is input type and is output type, which is...
No, that's not true. Oh. It is true in that you wouldn't be able to use the same type for them, but you could make 2 different types, an output type and an input type, that have the exact same shape. And those would be valid. So you would have an input type that accepted cat input and dog input under the names cat and dog, and you'd have an output type that output a cat and a dog under the names cat and dog. So those could be used, like the actual underlying type name doesn't matter.
Right.
It's just the fields.
I see what you're saying.
Cool.
And yeah, you can combine object types and scalar types in a more efficient manner.
Yeah, another one is, yeah, as you say, the scalars, which is very much been requested on various other things. And I think that is quite useful. And a lot of the things that we've discussed with regard to adding scalars to unions, for example, has said, well, we can't tell the difference between an int and a float necessarily by just sniffing the data. So if you were to combine a union, if you were to add a scalar to a union, you'd only be able to add one. Whereas with tag types, you can add any number. Also, you can add lists to a union. So you could have one of the options will be, it could be a list of animals, or it could be an animal, or it could be an integer. And all of those things could be in the same union, which is not possible with output unions currently. So there's a few more use cases.
I want to avoid alternative option. Benji, we actually discussed it like 2 months ago, and I didn't proceed to create anything. I did a small research. Basically, idea is to adopt one-off from protobuf instead of creating a new type. So it's in the middle between original idea of directive and your current proposal of creating separate entity and type system. So like one of just groups of fields. And I did research, and as far as I can tell, there is some issue with one of and protobuf, but they're all related to serialization format. For example, you cannot use one of for repeatable, inside repeatable objects and stuff, but it's caused by wire format. It's not caused by like design issue with one of itself. So I actually think it's like middle ground, and it's allow us to remove like set of problem with like type names and other things. But as we discussed, it's like it's sufficiently different that it's not like review. It's not like small differences, like different approach. So the question is, how should I start conversation about it? I was thinking about creating an issue and having like a table of what a separate type can do and like features, and basically saying like what either of these two proposals can do. So like comparison wise.
We already have a framework for comparing these solutions in the form of the input unions RFC. So I think the best direction to go for that would be to add it as solution 7 to the input unions RFC. We do have a solution 6, which I don't think is actually in that document. So I would encourage you to use the number 7 because we already discussed number 6, even though it's not written down yet, which is partly on me. So yeah, submit it there, answer the existing questions. We've got all the evaluation criteria. And then I think it would be good to discuss that as part of the input unions RFC working group. We can certainly arrange one of those once you've done that and see whether that works out to be a better solution.
And another issue, if another like ask for help, if somebody have experience with one-off and protobuf, because like my knowledge is purely theoretical. It would be interesting if somebody actually used one-off and protobuf and have like real experience about that. We can like, work together on this proposal to incorporate like good parts and omit bad parts.
So I'm not clear what the idea would be. How would you be specifying the type in the set?
The same way. So one of basically you create a group of fields inside the type. So when you specify type inside curly braces, you write one of and set of curly braces and like certain number of fields inside. So basic mechanism. So like my point is that basic mechanism is the same as Benji initially suggested, starting from directive. So most of the things are pretty similar. The big difference, even like ability to use input and output types, the big difference is that we create separate entity and type system, or we just add constraint to types. So protobuf decided. So what we're basically doing right now, even though we call it tagged union, it's like a new concept from like Rust and Swift and other modern languages. So like they decided to create separate types for it. In protobuf, they have like object type, and inside object type, you can group a field under one of. So mechanism is the same. So like you provide the field name when you send input, and you get nows. You don't get the field names for stuff that backend doesn't return. So like from query perspective, it's the same. There is like no difference from query perspective. It's a difference in like type system and introspection and like type name, for example, case. So if it's just a group inside the type, we just return name of the type. So like basic mechanism is the same. It's just like, I would say it's in the middle between directive and like what Benji currently suggested. And it's have prior history of protobuf. That's why I'm like interested in somebody have real life experience with one of protobuf, especially like design protobuf schemas.
Am I correct in thinking that this would be the first instance of a parameterized type in GraphQL?
Yeah. No. It makes me. I'm a little hesitant. In the past, we've been careful to avoid that kind of generic type or parameterized type because it becomes pretty challenging to represent in introspection. But I think like at this point, we should continue to explore alternatives. We should have high confidence that the one we propose is the right one. So we should keep doing that in parallel. I think that's the right thing to do. So I like Benji's suggestion. Oops, sorry, go ahead, Andy.
I just want to say overall it's really great to see like an outcome after all these years of discussion and work and yeah, I will definitely try to take some time and give it a thorough review and will hopefully provide more feedback.
Yep, I plan to do the same. Okay, with that, let's wrap the meeting. I know we only have about 10 minutes left until the end of the hour, so I want to make sure everybody has a chance to stretch before the rest of your day or evening. But thanks so much for walking us through this, Benji. This is a huge advancement, and you've done an awesome job getting this RFC put together in the spec. I feel like the next steps here are both collecting additional inline feedback, making sure that you're dialing in the spec text and answering some of these open questions. And then probably starting to implement an experimental version of this to make sure that we can actually support this from the parsing and execution side.
Okay, my plan is to leave it for a month or two to brew among the community, give people a chance to review it before coming back to it. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
All right, everybody. That concludes our meeting. Thanks so much. We covered a ton of ground today. Always appreciate it, and always a pleasure to get to hang out with all of you. Lovely group.
Can I raise a final question, which is how do we
Please.
get these recordings?
Oh man,
I raise it every 6 months.
I have the same question. They float around in the bowels of Zoom for a couple weeks and then output as raw files somewhere. Worst comes to worst, I'll find a way to get just like raw video files hosted in like a file service. The dream is to get them on YouTube, but that's proven to have been a problem. Oh, it is?
Yeah.
We fixed it?
Yeah. Yeah, like foundation guys figure out how to publish it. Even for GraphQL or HTTP, it's also already on YouTube. So basically all our archive of Zoom videos is on YouTube.
Okay.
I can send you a link.
Yeah.
Or
So somebody should share a link one day.
Let's actually a good operational thing we should do is once they inevitably find their way to YouTube, which I know takes a little bit of time, we should go back to the agendas that they're relevant for and post a link. So we just edit them, and in the same way that it says, you know, here's the meeting, here's the live notes, we just add one more thing. It's like YouTube recording.
Mm-hmm. And then we can accept pull requests to the notes that have a timestamp reference in the video where it says, Benji wrote this down wrong.
If anyone wants to do that, I'm happy to merge this in. That sounds like a lot of work.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Glad to hear that that's happening. All right, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your days and evenings. See you next time.